Hello, everyone. My name is R&CCH5LTacy. I'll be covering Chapter 5 of Race in the City. It's called Structural Economic Change and the Occupational Decline Among Black Workers in the 19th Century. And this is by Nancy Berto. I'm going to share my screen so I can get to a PowerPoint here. First, some introductory comments. Blacks have been kept at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder by racial occupational segregation. This occupational hierarchy is the chief mechanism that perpetuates the American class system. The question is, what is the cause of this segregation? The cause? Some say human capital, deficits in Blacks, less education, less training, less experience. Others say racial discrimination by employers, by white employees, and by the labor market itself. By looking at the history of the occupational segregation by race, it is clear that the human capital argument is false. The review of the history does show, in fact, that discrimination is the reason. As Cincinnati moved from a pre-industrial to an industrial economy, Blacks' occupational status actually worsened. White workers, they were able to take advantage of the new good jobs. The more prestigious occupations Black women and men managed to enter, such as barber or teacher, became less important in the Black workforce, while the low status occupations of labor and domestic service actually increased for Blacks. The irony is that this all occurred during a decline in formalized racism in terms of the legal arena. But these reforms did not end up helping in practice. This legal framework only was almost ignored totally because of the informal discriminatory barriers that were instituted by employers and white workers. The study of the Black workers in the 19th century also lays the foundation for what's continued into the 20th century. Here's an example. After World War II, there were major shifts in industrial manufacturing-based economy and the civil rights laws and affirmative action. Despite this, evidence shows that these economic and legal changes have only benefited the better educated Blacks, while the remaining have experienced occupational decline. So this story, while it's historical, just continues. Let's look at job competition, population growth, and the labor market. Let's first consider the demographic context of Blacks in Cincinnati. The population was 5% Blacks, but that's a large amount actually. And especially since we were on the other side of Kentucky here in Cincinnati, 5% was a pretty big number. And the reason was that this at least was a quote unquote free state. But even though we were a free state and Cincinnati was known for its abolitionism, there was also outbreaks of racism. In fact, there's one example of where there were 1,000 Blacks driven out of the city by whites who were trying to enforce an old law. It was a law written way back in 1804 that stated all Blacks had to register and show certificates of freedom, and get this, pay a $500 bond, $500 in 1800s, a lot of money. They also couldn't testify against whites in court, and they couldn't even hold public office or serve in the military. While the Black population increased throughout the 19th century as a percentage of the population, they actually decreased due to the influx of immigrants. Blacks outnumbered the foreign-born in 1825, but by 1840, there were more than twice the number of foreign-born than Blacks. And in 1850, it was 16-to-1 as the ratio. While immigration did decline after 1850, they still outnumbered Blacks and provided stiff competition for jobs, especially the Irish. Let's look at labor force participation. 1860 to 1890 saw labor force participation rates higher than whites, around 55% to 47%. By 1890, 28% of the Cincinnati labor force was Black, female, and male. The higher labor force participation rates among Blacks was due to lower earnings per family, and they began work at a younger age, and they had more family members that needed to work to meet the basic needs. And there were more women than men because they were more preferred. In effect, and this is the crux, Blacks worked more and worked harder for less. They did not attain, generally speaking, upward mobility in occupations like whites did. Let's look at the pre-industrial racial division of labor. Occupational information is actually pretty limited before 1850, but there's some information that can be gleaned from testimonials and review of directories. One quote stands out. Listen to this. The evils of slavery are not confined to the parts of the country where involuntary labor exists, but the neighborhood is infected. Certain kinds of labor are despised as work of slaves, end quote. So typically, occupations were things like boatmen, steamboat stewards, barbers, washerwomen, and laborers. The key significance to this data, and it's scant data, is that the restrictions to occupations was related to many doors being closed for Blacks. Another quote by a Black traveler is heart-wrenching. I thought upon coming to a free state like Ohio, I would find every door thrown open to receive me. But the treatment I have received by the people generally, I found it little better than in Virginia. I found every door closed against the colored man in a free state, excepting the jails and the penitentiaries, end quote. Discrimination also occurred in the educational setting, I'm sorry to say, with Blacks being barred from attending public schools. Another factor was the surge of German and Irish immigrant workers in the 1830s and 1840s. These German and Irish workers were willing to do menial labor, so this even restricted further access to Blacks. The only thing left in many cases was the lowest form of drudgery, for which employers preferred women. So Black women often earned the living. Added to this was white workers' disgust at having to work with Blacks, with trade unions backing them up. Cincinnati Blacks of both sexes were likely to hold low status jobs, being excluded from categories such as clerical and sales, traders and dealers, and craft trades. One exception noted for a time was the job of barber, which was available to Black male workers. Black and white women held different jobs as well. Whites were more likely to be domestic servants, while Blacks were more likely to be laundresses and hotel restaurant workers. There were very few Black women who taught, but of those who did, they actually had good training in the city's Black private schools. But listen to this. The Ohio Supreme Court had to weigh in, allowing the establishment of Black public schools. While Germans, no problem. Go ahead and set up your German-speaking schools. Only the Irish immigrants held comparable jobs to Blacks. One quote stands out. Irish and Negroes shared the Ohio River bottoms with wholesale houses and factories, end quote. And there were often fights amongst these two groups. And there was even a 2-day riot in 1862, which really left a trail of destruction. A changing structure of the economy. The economy of the Cincinnati area shifted from commerce to manufacturing. It reduced available jobs for Blacks as a result. railroads became used more than the river. You've heard the term the Queen City. It was during this time that Cincinnati became known as the Queen City, but that started to go away as we moved closer to the 20th century. Black jobs, such as steamboat-related jobs, diminished during this time. Cincinnati overall actually experienced new growth during this time, though, but not for Blacks. There were new factory jobs associated with manufacturing, but Blacks were rarely hired. White males and females were able to move into these new positions, including the Irish. Blacks even lost ground in the barbering trade, an area of some status for them previously. In fact, by 1890, the majority of Black men were employed as laborers or servants. And Black women, they worked more in jobs that white women abandoned. Black women became servants more and more as white women shifted to clerical and sales jobs, teaching posts, and factory jobs in the textile, boot and shoe, and cigar industries. In short, the pattern in the late 19th century was Blacks moving into jobs that became less important for whites, as well as being excluded from new jobs due to the structural economic change. While some say educational levels were to blame, no. The true fact is discrimination was the culprit. And the irony is that the legal barrier to racial inequality was basically reduced. They were given the right to vote. Black laws were repealed, and legislation was done to give Black children the opportunity to attend white schools. But in daily practice, they were systematically excluded from companies, unions, city government, due to racism by white employers. In fact, the public sector did not even allow Blacks to go for city jobs such as fireman and health inspector. And Black teachers, the few that were there, now listen to this, weren't allowed to supervise white children. They were excluded from trade unions. They were excluded from plumbing and electrical trades. Consider this quote. By the turn of the century, only nine Cincinnati Blacks were found in trade unions in the building trades. Most of these were older men, mostly bricklayers, and the latter all were said to be so light in color so as not to be noticed among the sunburned and brick dust covered men, end quote. Further, while in the past, some Black business owners and professionals had white clients, by the time we got to the end of the 19th century, most Blacks had no or very few white clients. The exclusion of Blacks from white-collar jobs in sales and clerical was very damaging because these jobs offered upper mobility. And while Blacks had access to schools, they were not allowed to enter into these types of jobs. By 1890, only 1% of the Black workforce were in these kinds of professions. Some concluding remarks I have here: from barbers and teachers to laborers and servants. While the Black population grew in Cincinnati in the 19th century, they were confined to labor-intensive, low-paying, and low-status jobs. And while the overall economy went successfully from a commercial center to an industrial city, Blacks' occupational status worsened. They experienced job dislocation. They were denied opportunity. And this all happened despite the improvements in the legal backdrop. Informal racism held sway. Progress for Blacks had to wait until the 20th century, when labor shortages created by world wars combined with better educational opportunities and legal challenges to employment discrimination, finally gave Blacks a degree of access to better jobs. Here's the question, though. Was it too little, too late? Thank you for listening to our summary of Chapter 5.